The 1968 New York Jets might be the strangest Super Bowl champions of all time. Not in terms of personalities or anything like that, but for the fact that they won the Super Bowl in the first place. Obviously, the Jets won Super Bowl III by defeating the Baltimore Colts in arguably the biggest upset in the history of professional football, where no one was giving the champions of the American Football League a chance in the world against one of the best NFL champions of all time on paper. But I say that the Jets were one of the strangest champions ever because the losses that they had were so bizarre and made no logical sense whatsoever. The Jets went 13-3 across the regular season and the playoffs. They were a heck of a team. But when they lost a game, I can't even explain it because it defied all logic. It would be like if the Philadelphia Eagles this year lost 3 games, and those 3 games were getting swept by the New York Giants and losing to the Cleveland Browns. It would be like if the 1985 Chicago Bears went 15-1, but their one loss wasn't to Dan Marino's Miami Dolphins, but rather was to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as in the team that had the #1 pick in the draft. New York lost 3 games in 1968, and all 3 of those losses were notable for 3 very different reasons. One of them was the infamous Heidi game against the Oakland Raiders, where no one on the East Coast was able to see the ending to the game because the game ran too long, and NBC decided to preempt the ending of the game to show the family movie on time, which, spoiler alert, did not go over well, seeing as the Jets were winning at the time the movie started, and by the time the movie ended, the Raiders had come back miraculously to win the game 43-32. You can learn more about that incident by clicking the card in the upper right corner, seeing as it is, without a doubt, the most famous broadcasting controversy in the history of American sports. One of them was a 37-35 loss to the Buffalo Bills, a team that finished the season with just 1 win, and was so bad that they fired their coach in the middle of the season, started 4 different quarterbacks, had the worst offense in the league, and got the #1 pick in the combined NFL-AFL draft. The Bills scored 7 or fewer points in 6 of their 14 games, so roughly half the time, they couldn't muster up more than 7. And yet, their 1 win, they dropped 37 on the team that would win the Super Bowl. Because that makes sense. And the other game that the Jets lost? It was this game right here. A game against the Denver Broncos that was bizarre for a completely different reason. Because it featured a member of the Broncos literally doing nothing. And when I say nothing, I truly mean nothing. A member of the Broncos was living the dream, getting paid to do nothing, all in the name of superstition and not messing up a winning formula. And we're going to break it down here today. Because this is the story behind the man on the Broncos who got paid to just stand there. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. Because we post every single day about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL. And every like and subscription helps as we try and grow this community even more. So thanks in advance, and with that in mind, let's talk about the luckiest Bronco ever. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand how the Broncos were doing prior to their game against the Jets. 3 weeks into the 1968 season, and the Denver Broncos, much like previous years and much like the 1967 season where they went 3-11, were one of the laughingstocks of the American Football League, and were not a team to be taken seriously. It started in their first game on September 15th with a loss to the Cincinnati Bengals, an expansion team who had literally never played a game before. It continued in their second game on September 22nd with a loss to the Kansas City Chiefs where they lost 34-2, and continued again in their third game with a loss to the Boston Patriots. 3 games into the season, and the Broncos were 0-3, scoring just 29 points, or less than 10 points per game. Unsurprisingly, this was the worst total in the league. Their point differential of -49 was by a fairly comfortable margin the worst total in the West. They were the only team in the West to not have a win, as every other team had at least 2 wins by this point. And seeing as only the #1 team in each division made it to the playoffs back then, and by this point, the Broncos were already 3 games out of first place, their season was over before October hit. The Broncos had never had a winning record in franchise history, and had finished the season with double-digit losses in each of the previous 5 seasons. And so far in 1968, after their 0-3 start, it seemed like it was going to be more the same for the Bronco faithful. However, something changed during their next game against the Cincinnati Bengals. It was a rematch against the team that beat them Week 1 in a stunning result, except this time, the game was taking place at Mile High, so the Broncos had the home field advantage. And for the first time all season, the Broncos did it. It wasn't the prettiest game, but for the first time in 1968, the Broncos were in the win column, as when all was said and done, the Broncos won this one by a final score of 10-7. Despite trailing 7-0 at the half and replacing starting quarterback Marlon Briscoe, who was ineffective in the first half, with Steve Tensey, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, Denver was able to win it in the fourth quarter after he found Mike Hafner on a 4-yard pass. Denver turned the ball over 7 times in their previous 2 games, but against the Bengals, they didn't turn the ball over once. It was a remarkably clean game, and was the first time since October 30th, 1966, nearly 2 full years ago, that the Broncos went an entire game without turning the ball over. Defensively, the 7 points allowed was just the second time since November of 1962 that the Broncos held an opponent to single digits. The fact that this was just the second time in 6 full years that Denver did that should tell you a lot about how bad the Broncos were during the 1960s, but I digress. And the Broncos gave Cincinnati starting quarterback John Stofa fits, as even though he didn't throw any interceptions, he only finished the game going 15 for 38 with 136 net passing yards, completing just 39% of his passes on 3.5 net yards per pass attempt. Bottom line, the Broncos stepped up to the plate here when it mattered most, and they finally got a win. And after the game against the Bengals, in this game right here, the Broncos' next opponent was on the road against the vaunted New York Jets, as in the unquestioned favorites by this point to win the East. From an equipment standpoint, the plan for the Broncos was simple. They were going to fly out on Saturday, so on Friday, equipment manager Larry Elliott was going to paint all of the helmets. For the roughly 40 players on the Broncos, all of their helmets were going to be repainted so they look spotless. This is normal procedure. If there were any spots on the helmets that are dirty, either because something chipped away on a hit, or because of a grass stain or a mud stain, or because it was a rainy day, the equipment manager is responsible for repainting the helmet. As you can probably expect, this is a long and tedious process. It's not like it is today. To do this for 40 players is a lot of work, but this is one of the main responsibilities of the equipment manager, which is why Elliott decided to say something after the game against the Bengals and before this game right here against the Jets. He said, "Hey guys, we just won against the Bengals. We just got our first win of the season. What if I just don't paint the helmets this week?" It could be a reminder of how hard the Broncos fought in order to win that game. They see the stains from the Bengal game, and they're inspired. It could be something like the imperialism map, where you've got the colors from different teams on your helmet as a reminder of who you conquered. It could be a superstitious thing, like how you don't change a winning formula, and you don't shave a playoff beard until the playoffs are done. But Elliott proposed to the team that he shouldn't paint the helmets this week. And the players, amazingly enough, said to him, "Larry, this is an amazing idea." Elliott had been with the team since 1966, and had painted the helmets every Friday before games, as is customary. But this week, he had the week off, all in the name of superstition. As Elliott said on this, "I just idly mentioned maybe I shouldn't paint them, and the players jumped on the idea. I painted them every Friday since I came here 3 years ago." It's almost like this. Imagine if you play scratch-offs every week, and you do the scratch-off at the same exact spot, where you'll scratch off the numbers at your dining room table. You have a house cleaning service that comes in once a week and cleans up the house, and the cleaner always does a deep clean of the house. Well, imagine that for the first time ever, you'll win big on the scratch-off, and you say to the cleaner, "You don't have to deep clean the house this week. I'm going to pay you, but you don't have to do that for this week." because no way am I messing up this good juju. That's what this was like. Larry Elliott, prior to this game against the Jets, was going to be off the hook from doing anything, all because the Broncos won one singular game and wanted to keep their superstition alive. They didn't want to clean a uniform that was dirty so long as they were winning. And sure enough, it worked. I don't know how, but the Broncos ended up winning the game against the Jets, and they took down the eventual Super Bowl champions by a final score of 21-13. Joe Namath is one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the sport, and he's a Hall of Famer for a reason. But he had one of his worst days ever as a pro, as the Bronco defense completely gave him fits, with Namath completing less than 50% of his passes while throwing no touchdowns and 5 interceptions and posting a passer rating of 37.8, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Keep in mind, the Jets were favored to win this game by 19 points. The Baltimore Colts, when they lost Super Bowl III to the Jets in that huge upset, were favored by 18 points. Technically speaking, the Broncos going on the road to Shea Stadium and defeating the Jets was a bigger upset than the Jets defeating the Colts at a neutral site, even though no one views it like that all these years later. It was one of the biggest upsets, though, in Bronco history, however you want to look at it. The Broncos, once again, did not turn the ball over, and they forced 5 themselves. Anytime that you're +5 in the turnover column, you're in a good spot to win any football game against any team. And it was all because their equipment manager was being paid to do absolutely nothing, all in the name of superstition. Which meant, as you could probably guess, that for Denver's game the following week against the San Diego Chargers, there was no way that Larry Elliott was painting the helmets. After back-to-back wins with the strategy working, and after one of the biggest upsets of all time, the helmets are going to be multicolored for all I care. The helmets can be worn down and chipped away for all I care. Nothing is changing. I'm not doing a thing. As Elliott said, we've got Cincinnati orange and New York white on those helmets. Eventually, the winning streak came to an end, and Elliott had to work again and actually, do his job. But for those few weeks, thanks to that game against the Jets, he was getting paid to literally do nothing. He was living the American dream in the eyes of a lot of people. Just collect a paycheck and don't lift a finger. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that something like this could not happen today, simply because equipment standards are way more regulated than they were back in the 1960s. There are other ways to do superstitions. This one probably wouldn't fly. However, it is crazy to think that the Broncos beating the Jets as 19-point underdogs was partially sparked by an equipment manager who did nothing and just didn't want to work. If you try this with your boss when something's going well with that company, your mileage may vary, and I can't promise the same success that Larry Elliott had. Elliott was the equipment manager in Denver for nearly 2 decades, and he only resigned from his post after the strike-shortened 1982 season. So for many years, he was a mainstay in that organization. But he might be best remembered today for being the equipment manager that, in the name of superstition, did absolutely nothing and got a paycheck for doing so. Because in 1968, even though the Broncos didn't paint their helmets, they painted another win in the win column. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.